The cabin glowed like a lantern in the frozen darkness, warm light streaming through horizontal gaps that ran across the entire roof. Every trapper who saw it called Lars Haugen insane for building a roof with holes. But on the night Thomas Wickham's sealed cabin turned into a tomb of ice, those useless gaps were the only thing standing between survival and death in the killing winter of 1863. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of forgotten frontier wisdom move you, hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's tale is even more unbelievable. Lars Haugen pushed open the cabin door on the morning of February 9, 1863, and knew immediately that Peter Dahlberg was dead. The interior was colder than the outside air, which made no sense. The fire had burned down to coals, but there should have been residual warmth. Instead, the cabin felt like a root cellar, damp and frigid in a way that went deeper than simple cold. Peter lay in his bunk against the far wall, still wrapped in his blankets. Lars crossed the small space and touched his partner's shoulder. The body was stiff, frozen solid beneath layers of wool and bearskin that should have kept any man warm. But the blankets themselves told the story Lars didn't want to see. They were soaked through, heavy with moisture that had frozen into stiff sheets of fabric and ice. Lars stepped back and looked up at the roof. What he saw made his stomach turn. The entire underside of the roof structure was covered in ice formations. Thick ridges of white frost clung to every log and beam. In the corners where the roof met the walls, icicles hung down like teeth, some nearly a foot long. The ice wasn't on the outside of the cabin. It was inside, growing from the interior surfaces, fed by moisture that had nowhere to go. He understood what had happened. Peter had sealed the cabin tight against the January cold, just like every mountain man was taught to do. He had kept a fire burning, melting snow for water, cooking his meals, breathing warm air into the small space. That warm air, heavy with moisture, had risen to the roof. When it hit the cold logs overhead, the moisture condensed instantly. During the day, when the fire burned hot, some of that ice melted and dripped down. The water soaked into Peter's bedding, his supplies, everything in the cabin. Then at night, when the fire died down and the temperature dropped, everything froze solid again. Peter had died of hypothermia in his own cabin, killed not by the cold outside, but by the wet cold of his own soaked blankets. He had probably been too exhausted or too far into hypothermia to realize what was happening. The tight cabin that was supposed to protect him had become a trap that concentrated moisture and cold in the worst possible way. Lars spent that day burying Peter on a hillside above their camp. The ground was frozen 18 inches deep. It took him 6 hours with a pick and shovel to dig a grave that was barely adequate. He marked it with stones and stood there as the sun set, thinking about how many mountain men died exactly this way. They sealed their cabins tight, burned their fires, and slowly drowned in frozen condensation without ever understanding what was killing them. That night, Lars couldn't sleep in the cabin. The ice formations above him felt like a threat, like the roof might collapse under the weight of frozen moisture that had been building all winter. He spent the night outside by a fire, wrapped in dry blankets, staring at the cabin that had killed his partner. And somewhere in those long, dark hours, an obsession took root that would change everything. Lars spent the next 3 weeks living in that cabin, but he wasn't trapping. He was studying. Every morning he woke before dawn and examined the ice formations on the roof. He tracked how they grew during the night when the fire burned low. He watched how they melted during the day when he built the fire up hot. He collected the dripping water in tin cups and measured how much moisture was coming out of the frozen roof structure. Some days he collected nearly a quart of water from a single corner of the cabin. He started experimenting with ventilation. He opened the door for an hour each morning despite the freezing temperatures outside. The interior ice formations grew less rapidly, but the cabin became unbearably cold. He tried leaving a gap at the top of the door by propping it open with a piece of wood. That helped slightly, but not enough. The fundamental problem remained. Warm, moist air rose to the roof, hit the cold surface, and turned to ice. The cycle repeated endlessly. Lars began visiting other trappers' cabins in the area. There were 5 within a day's travel. He made excuses for the visits, bringing coffee or salt, offering to help with work, anything to get inside and look at their roofs. Every single cabin had the same problem. Ice on the interior roof surfaces, damp corners, moisture dripping from beams. Some cabins were worse than others depending on how tightly they were sealed and how much the occupants cooked and melted snow inside. But every cabin had the problem to some degree. When Lars mentioned what he was seeing, the other trappers looked at him like he was speaking a foreign language. Silas Cobb, an older mountain man who had survived 15 winters in the high country, told him directly that he was worrying about nothing. "A little ice never hurt anybody," Silas said. "You keep that cabin sealed tight and keep your fire burning. That's how you survive winter." When Lars mentioned that Peter had died from hypothermia caused by wet bedding from roof condensation, Silas shrugged. "Peter let his fire go out. That's what killed him. Fire goes out, you freeze. Simple as that." But it wasn't simple. Lars knew what he had seen. Peter's fire had been burning when he died. The coals were still warm. What killed him was sleeping in. Blankets that had absorbed so much moisture from the dripping roof ice that they no longer provided insulation. Wet wool in freezing temperatures was worse than no blanket at all. It pulled heat from your body faster than you could generate it. Thomas Wickham, an English settler who had built a cabin 2 miles downriver, was even less receptive. "You're overthinking this, Haugen. Mountain men have been building cabins this way for 50 years. If there was a problem, someone would have figured it out by now." Thomas gestured at his own cabin roof, which had visible ice formations in the corners. "A little frost is natural. You can't fight nature. You work with it." Lars stopped talking to the other trappers about what he was seeing. They weren't going to listen. They had been taught to build cabins a certain way, and questioning that method felt like questioning their entire understanding of survival, but Lars couldn't stop thinking about it. Spring came late in 1863. Lars packed his winter's worth of furs and made the long journey to St. Paul to sell them. Most trappers spent their time in town drinking and gambling, celebrating survival through another winter. Lars had different priorities. He spent his days walking through the city studying buildings. He started at the warehouses near the river. These were large structures that stored grain and goods through winter. Lars noticed they had ventilation gaps built into their walls near the roof lines, small openings covered with slats that allowed air to move through the building even when doors were closed. He asked a warehouse supervisor why they built them that way. The man explained that trapped moisture would rot the grain and warp the stored goods. Air circulation kept everything dry. Lars visited an ice house next. This fascinated him more than anything else. The ice house stored huge blocks of river ice through summer, keeping them frozen using nothing but sawdust insulation and careful construction. He studied how they built the roof. It had multiple layers with air gaps between them. The gaps allowed moisture from the melting ice to escape upward without condensing on the interior surfaces. The builder explained that trapped moisture would cause the ice to melt faster. Ventilation was critical. On his 4th day in St. Paul, Lars met a carpenter named Christian Berg, working on a boarding house addition. Berg was Norwegian, like Lars's own father had been. They spoke for a few minutes in Norwegian, and Lars asked him about building in cold climates. Berg invited him to share a meal that evening. Over salt pork and potatoes, Lars described what he had seen in the mountain cabins: the ice formations, the dripping moisture, Peter's death. Berg listened carefully and then explained something Lars had never heard before. He used the Norwegian words for it first, then translated: condensation point, dew point. The temperature at which air could no longer hold moisture and water began forming on surfaces. "In Norway, we build with air gaps in roofs," Berg said, "especially in the north where winters are very cold. If you trap warm air against a cold surface, you get water. The water freezes. The ice builds up. Eventually, it causes problems. Berg sketched a simple diagram on the table using charcoal. He drew a roof with gaps between the boards, arrows showing warm air rising and escaping through the gaps. "The air must move," he said. "If it sits still against cold wood, moisture will condense. If it moves through and out, the moisture leaves with it. The roof stays dry." Lars asked why mountain men didn't build this way. Berg shrugged. "Most builders here learned from English and American carpenters. They build for rain, not for extreme cold and moisture together. In Norway, we learned the hard way over hundreds of years. Sealed buildings in extreme cold kill people slowly. Most don't understand why." Lars bought Berg 3 drinks and filled a notebook with sketches and measurements. He spent his entire earnings from the fur sale on milled lumber, spacing tools, and iron brackets. When he left St. Paul 2 weeks later, other trappers laughed at his loaded wagon. Thomas Wickham asked him if he was planning to build a hotel in the wilderness. Lars returned to the mountains in late July 1863 with his wagon loaded with materials that made no sense to anyone who saw them. Milled lumber was expensive and heavy. Most trappers used whatever logs they could cut nearby. The iron brackets and specialized spacing tools looked like equipment for a carpenter's shop, not a wilderness cabin. When Thomas Wickham stopped by Lars's camp 3 days after his return, he stared at the supplies with confusion. "What exactly are you building, Haugen?" Thomas asked, picking up one of the spacing blocks. It was a precisely cut piece of wood, exactly 2 inches thick, sanded smooth on all sides. "A cabin," Lars said simply. "With fancy city lumber? And what are these blocks for?" "Roof gaps," Lars said. 2 inches between each board, precise spacing across the whole roof. Thomas laughed, then stopped when he realized Lars was serious. "You're building a roof with holes in it? On purpose?" "They're ventilation gaps. They let moisture escape so it doesn't freeze on the interior surface." Thomas shook his head slowly. "This is madness. You can't build a roof with gaps in it. You'll freeze to death. Every bit of heat you make will go straight up through those holes." "Some heat will escape," Lars agreed. "But the moisture will escape too. That's the point. The point of a roof is to keep the weather out and the warmth in. What you're describing is the opposite of a roof." Thomas's voice shifted to genuine concern. "I know you spent time in St. Paul talking to city builders, but they don't understand mountain winters. You can't use their ideas up here?" Lars stopped working and looked at Thomas directly. "Peter died because his cabin was too tight. The moisture had nowhere to go. It froze on the roof and dripped on his bedding. He froze to death in wet blankets inside a cabin with a fire burning. Peter died because he let his fire go too low," Thomas said firmly. "You keep the fire hot, you stay alive. Simple." Over the next 2 weeks, every trapper within 20 miles found a reason to visit Lars's camp. Silas Cobb came by and called it the stupidest thing I've seen a man plan in 40 years of wilderness living. Jacob Reinhardt, a German trapper, watched him work for an hour and then said, "You know you're building a cabin to heat the forest, yes? The birds will thank you." Margaret Wickham, Thomas's wife, was kinder but no less skeptical. "Mr. Haugen, Thomas says you're planning to leave gaps in your roof intentionally. Surely that can't be right?" Lars was serious. He had selected his cabin site carefully on high ground with good drainage. He had laid a proper foundation using rock and gravel. Now he was beginning the most important part, the part everyone thought was insane. He was building a roof that would let air move through it continuously, carrying moisture away before it could condense and freeze. The mockery didn't bother him. He had seen what sealed cabins did to the men who lived in them. He had buried Peter because of it. If the other trappers wanted to laugh, let them laugh. He would build it right regardless of what anyone said about his methods or his sanity. The cabin walls went up in standard fashion. Lars used traditional notched log construction because the walls weren't the problem. Solid walls kept wind out and provided structural support. It was the roof that needed to be different, and Lars knew he would only get one chance to build it correctly. He started with the ridge beam, a carefully selected log that ran the length of the cabin at the peak. This beam had to be strong because the entire roof structure would hang from it. He notched it into the end walls and secured it with iron brackets. Most mountain men would have simply laid a log across and called it done. Lars spent 2 days ensuring the ridge beam was perfectly level and absolutely solid. The rafters came next. These were milled 2 by 6-inch boards, not rough logs. Lars had brought them from St. Paul specifically because they were uniform in dimension. He needed precision for what he was planning. He cut each rafter to exactly the same length and notched them to sit on the top wall logs at a 45-degree angle. The steep pitch would shed snow quickly and prevent accumulation that might block his ventilation gaps. He spaced the rafters 18 inches apart, closer than standard construction. This would provide support for the roof boards while maintaining structural integrity despite the gaps he was about to create. Each rafter was secured with iron brackets and wooden pegs driven through pre-drilled holes. The construction was overbuilt by frontier standards, but Lars understood that his ventilated roof would have less inherent strength than a solid one. The roof boards were where his technique became truly revolutionary. He used milled planks 3 inches wide and 1 inch thick. Standard cabin roofs used whatever split logs or bark sheets were available, laid tight together to keep weather out. Lars did the opposite. He laid his first board along the bottom edge of the rafters and secured it with nails. Then he placed one of his spacing blocks against it, a precisely cut piece of wood exactly 2 inches thick. He laid the next board tight against the spacing block, secured it, and removed the block. The result was a perfect 2-inch gap between the boards. He repeated this process across the entire roof. 3-inch board, 2-inch gap, 3-inch board, 2-inch gap. The pattern continued from the bottom edge to the ridge beam. The work was slow and demanding. Each board had to be cut to exact length. Each gap had to be precisely maintained. If the spacing varied, the ventilation would be uneven and potentially ineffective. Thomas Wickham visited during the 3rd week of construction. He stood looking at the half-finished roof with its obvious gaps and shook his head. "Lars, it's not too late to change your mind. Nail some boards over those gaps. Build it right." "It is right," Lars said quietly. "You're going to freeze to death this winter, and everyone will say you were warned." Lars continued working. The gaps ran in perfect parallel lines across the roof surface, allowing continuous air circulation from the bottom edge to the peak. Warm, moist air would rise naturally and escape through these channels, carrying moisture away before condensation could occur. Lars moved into his completed cabin in early September 1863. The first thing he noticed was the sound. Air moved constantly through the roof gaps with a soft whisper that was audible in the quiet evenings. It wasn't a draft or a whistle, just steady, gentle movement of air from the interior space upward and out through the ventilation channels. Most cabins were silent except for wind against the exterior walls. Lars's cabin breathed. He built his first fire in the stone fireplace and monitored what happened. Warm air rose from the fire and spread across the ceiling. In a sealed cabin, that warm air would press against the cold roof logs and create condensation immediately. In Lars's cabin, the warm air kept moving. It flowed upward through the gaps and escaped into the outside air. He could see it on cold mornings when he stepped outside. Thin streams of warm vapor rose from each gap in the roof, visible evidence that the system was working exactly as intended. The interior stayed remarkably dry. Lars cooked meals, melted snow for water, and breathed warm, moist air into the space constantly. In Peter's old cabin, these activities had created dripping condensation within hours. In Lars's new cabin, moisture never accumulated. The moving air carried it away continuously. He ran his hand along the underside of the roof boards every morning. They were dry, no frost, no ice, no condensation at all. Thomas Wickham visited in late October as the first serious cold arrived. The temperature had dropped to 20 below zero the previous night. Thomas expected to find Lars huddled miserably in a freezing cabin, burning enormous amounts of firewood to compensate for heat loss through the roof gaps. Instead, he found Lars comfortable, working on equipment repair at his table, with a modest fire burning in the fireplace. "How much wood are you burning?" Thomas asked immediately. "About the same as last winter," Lars said. "Maybe slightly more, but not much." Thomas looked up at the roof. Even from inside, the gaps were visible as thin lines where daylight showed through. "That makes no sense. You're heating the whole forest through those gaps." "Some heat escapes," Lars agreed. "But not as much as you'd think. The gaps are narrow. Most of the heat stays in the cabin. What escapes is the moisture." Thomas walked to the corner where Peter's old cabin had always shown the worst ice buildup. He touched the logs, completely dry. He looked up at the roof boards directly above. No frost, no ice formations, nothing. "I don't understand how this is working." "The air moves before it can condense," Lars explained. "In your cabin, warm air sits against the cold roof until moisture forms. In my cabin, the air keeps moving out through the gaps. The moisture leaves with it." Thomas left that day without saying much. He didn't apologize for calling Lars insane, but he looked troubled. Lars noticed him glancing back at the cabin multiple times as he walked away, studying the roof gaps that glowed faintly with interior warmth. December 1863 brought cold that old-timers said they hadn't seen in 30 years. The temperature dropped to 30 below zero in the first week and stayed there. By mid-month, it had fallen to 40 below. The cold was deep and persistent, the kind that made trees crack like rifle shots in the night and turned breath to ice crystals before it left your mouth. Every mountain man in the territory retreated to their cabins and prepared to wait out the cold. They stockpiled firewood within arm's reach of their doors. They sealed every crack and gap they could find with mud, moss, and rags. They built their fires hot and kept them burning constantly. The conventional wisdom was simple: keep the cabin tight, keep the fire burning, stay inside until the cold broke. Lars followed a different approach. He kept his fire modest, burning steadily but not intensely. He didn't seal any additional gaps or try to make his cabin tighter. The roof gaps continued doing exactly what they were designed to do, allowing warm, moist air to escape continuously. On the coldest mornings, he could see dozens of thin vapor streams rising from his roof, visible proof that the ventilation system was working even in extreme conditions. The interior of his cabin remained dry. He cooked his meals, melted snow for drinking water, and lived normally. The underside of his roof boards showed no frost, no ice, no condensation. His bedding stayed dry. His stored food remained in good condition. The temperature inside was cold, certainly, but it was a dry cold that was manageable with proper clothing and blankets. Thomas Wickham's experience was different. His tightly sealed cabin trapped every bit of moisture he created. His breath, his cooking, the snow he melted for water, all of it became condensation on his roof. During the day, when his fire burned hot, the condensation melted and dripped. At night, when the fire died down slightly, everything froze solid. Within a week, his cabin interior looked like a cave. Ice formations hung from the roof beams. The corners where roof met walls were covered in thick frost. Water dripped constantly onto his supplies and bedding during the warm parts of the day. Thomas tried everything. He built his fire hotter, thinking more heat would solve the problem. That just created more moisture that condensed more rapidly. He tried opening his door for ventilation, but the incoming cold air made the cabin unbearable, and the moisture problem continued. He hung canvas over his bunk to protect his bedding from dripping ice, but the canvas itself became soaked and froze. By the third week of December, Thomas's stored food was damaged by moisture. His blankets were perpetually damp. The interior of his cabin dripped and froze in endless cycles. He was burning twice as much firewood as usual and still couldn't stay warm because everything he owned was wet. Other trappers in the area faced similar conditions. Silas Cobb abandoned his cabin entirely and built a lean-to with an open fire, preferring to sleep outside rather than inside the frozen trap his sealed cabin had become. Thomas Wickham appeared at Lars's cabin on December 23, 1863, carrying what supplies he could manage. His face was exhausted, his coat soaked through in places where melting ice had dripped on him. He stood in the doorway looking ashamed and desperate. "My cabin is uninhabitable," Thomas said quietly. "Everything is wet. The ice buildup is so heavy, I'm afraid the roof will collapse. I have nowhere else to go." Lars stepped aside without a word and let him in. Thomas entered and immediately noticed the difference. Lars's cabin was dry. The air was cold but breathable. There was no dripping water, no ice formations hanging from beams, no frozen moisture covering every surface. Thomas set his pack down and looked up at the roof gaps, thin lines of daylight visible even from inside. "I don't understand," Thomas said. "It's 40 below outside. Your roof has holes in it, but your cabin is dry and mine is a frozen nightmare." "The air moves," Lars said simply. He was preparing coffee over his fire. "In your cabin, moisture builds up, because it has nowhere to go. In my cabin, it goes out through the gaps before it can condense." Thomas sat heavily on a stool. "I burned 3 times my normal firewood trying to keep warm. Everything I own is damp. My bedding is frozen solid. I couldn't sleep because water was dripping on me all night, then freezing. I thought I was doing everything right." "You were doing what everyone taught you to do," Lars said. "Seal the cabin tight. Keep the fire hot. It works in moderate cold. In extreme cold with constant fires, it creates a moisture trap." Over the next week, 3 more trappers showed up at Lars's cabin with similar stories. Jacob Reinhardt arrived on Christmas Day, his supplies ruined by moisture damage. Silas Cobb came 2 days later, admitting his cabin had become unlivable. A younger trapper named William Brooks appeared on December 30th, half frozen because he had been sleeping in the open rather than inside his ice-filled cabin. Lars's small cabin became crowded, but it remained dry. 5 men cooking, melting snow, breathing warm air into the space continuously, yet the moisture never accumulated. It escaped through the roof gaps in steady streams. The men could see it working. They watched vapor rise through the gaps. They felt the gentle upward movement of air. They touched the dry roof boards and compared them to the ice-covered surfaces they had left behind in their own cabins. Thomas spent hours studying the roof construction. He measured the gaps with his fingers. He asked Lars detailed questions about spacing, rafter placement, and pitch angle. Jacob Reinhardt sketched diagrams in a notebook. Silas Cobb, who had called the design stupid 3 months earlier, admitted he had been wrong. "I've survived 15 winters," Silas said quietly one evening. "I thought I knew everything about building cabins. Turns out I didn't know the most important thing. You were right, Haugen. We were all wrong." Lars didn't gloat or lecture. He simply shared his cabin and his knowledge with men who needed both. The killing cold broke in mid-January 1864. Temperatures rose to manageable levels, and the trappers who had sheltered in Lars's cabin returned to survey the damage at their own places. Thomas Wickham's cabin required 2 weeks of work to become livable again. He had to remove ruined supplies, dry out everything that could be saved, and scrape away the ice that had built up on interior surfaces. Jacob Reinhardt's situation was similar. Silas Cobb decided to abandon his old cabin entirely. By early February, Jacob Reinhardt was building a new cabin using Lars's ventilated roof design. He asked Lars for measurements and guidance, which Lars provided freely. Jacob cut his roof boards to 3 inches wide and used spacing blocks to maintain exact 2-inch gaps. He built his rafters at the same 45-degree pitch Lars had used. The construction took longer than standard methods, but Jacob understood why the precision mattered. Thomas Wickham watched Jacob's construction carefully and began planning his own rebuild. He approached Lars in late February with detailed questions about rafter spacing, board thickness, and whether the technique would work with a slightly different roof pitch. Lars explained the principles rather than just giving measurements. The air needed to move continuously upward. The gaps needed to be wide enough for airflow, but narrow enough to prevent snow intrusion. The pitch needed to be steep enough for snow to slide off rather than accumulate and block the gaps. By spring 1864, 4 new cabins in the territory featured ventilated roofs. The trappers didn't call them Lars's design or give him specific credit. They simply called them gap roofs or ventilated construction, as if the technique had always existed. Lars didn't mind. He had never been interested in recognition. He had been interested in not freezing to death in a cabin full of ice. Word spread through the informal networks that connected mountain communities. A trapper from Wyoming visited in summer and saw Jacob's ventilated cabin. He asked questions, took measurements, and built one himself when he returned home. A supply merchant traveling between camps mentioned the technique to other trappers. A settler moving through the territory saw Thomas's rebuilt cabin and asked about the unusual roof design. The spread was organic and anonymous. Nobody promoted the technique through formal channels. There were no written guides or official recommendations. It simply solved a real problem that killed people regularly, and solutions to deadly problems spread naturally among people who wanted to survive. By winter 1865, an estimated dozen cabins across Montana and Wyoming territories featured ventilated roofs built using variations of Lars's basic design. Lars continued trapping through 1867, then left the mountains permanently. He had saved enough money to buy land in a settled area. He wanted a quieter life, away from the extreme conditions that had killed Peter and nearly killed so many others. When he left, he didn't write down his techniques or make any formal record of what he had developed. The knowledge existed in the cabins themselves, built into the gaps and angles of their roofs, passed from builder to builder through observation and practical need. Lars Haugen died on March 14, 1889, at age 61 in a small house outside Helena, Montana. He had lived quietly for more than 20 years after leaving the mountains. He had married, worked as a carpenter, and raised 2 children who never knew about his years as a trapper. His death was recorded in local records with no mention of innovations or wilderness survival techniques. He was buried in a cemetery on the edge of town under a simple stone that listed his name and dates, nothing more. But in the mountains he had left behind, his legacy remained built into the landscape. Cabins with ventilated roofs still stood throughout Montana and Wyoming territories. Some were occupied by new generations of trappers and settlers. Others served as way stations for travelers moving through remote areas. A few had been abandoned, but remained structurally sound, their distinctive roof gaps visible to anyone who passed by. The technique had evolved as different builders adapted it to their specific needs and available materials. Some used wider gaps, some narrower. Some built at steeper pitches, others more gradual. But the core principle remained consistent across all variations. Air must move continuously through the roof to carry moisture away before condensation can occur. Sealed cabins in extreme cold create death traps. Ventilated construction prevents that. By the 1880s, the method was common enough that new settlers building in cold territories often included roof ventilation without knowing where the idea originated. It was simply how you built in extreme cold if you wanted your cabin to remain habitable through winter. The phrase gap roof became standard terminology. Some called it Norwegian style because Lars had learned the principles from Christian Berg. Others called it mountain method, as if it had developed naturally from frontier experience rather than from one man's obsessive study after his partner's death. Modern historians examining frontier construction techniques can identify dozens of surviving structures that show clear evidence of ventilated roof design. The earliest examples date to 1863 and 1864 in southwestern Montana, exactly where and when Lars built his original cabin. The technique spreads geographically and chronologically in patterns that suggest organic adoption rather than planned dissemination. This matches perfectly with how frontier innovations actually spread, through observation and practical necessity rather than formal education or written instruction. The exact number of lives saved by ventilated roof construction is impossible to calculate. Deaths from hypothermia in wilderness cabins were common but often went unrecorded. What can be stated with confidence is that the technique solved a specific deadly problem. Trappers and settlers who built ventilated cabins did not die from sleeping in frozen bedding soaked by interior condensation. They did not abandon their cabins during extreme cold because ice buildup made them uninhabitable. They survived winters that killed men in sealed cabins. Lars Haugen never claimed credit for this, never promoted himself as an innovator, never sought recognition. He built something that worked, shared the knowledge freely, and walked away. The impossible became routine, not through fame or glory, but through gaps in timber that let moisture escape and men survive.